quiet archive record. Tonight, we're stepping into a slow unfolding. Settle in. Let the outside world dissolve and gently descend into tonight's world. Telepathy is a claim with two faces. One face is ordinary and human. We sense moods. We predict what familiar people will do. We finish each other's sentences. The other face is the claim that information can pass from one mind to another without normal senses. That second claim is the one that sparks arguments, experiments, and long nights of debate. In this episode, we treat telepathy like a case file. We look at what researchers have tried to measure, what results have been reported, how skeptics explain those results, and what remains unresolved. The goal is not to sell belief. The goal is to map the strongest evidence, the strongest critiques, and what we can honestly say when the room is quiet. Tonight, we examine everything we know about telepathy. Start with definitions, because confusion is where this topic hides. When people say telepathy, they can mean several different things. They can mean emotional contagion. You walk into a room and you sense tension. That is real, but it travels through normal channels: facial expression, posture, tone, and context. They can mean intuition, a sudden hunch that turns out right. That can be pattern recognition and memory working below awareness. They can mean empathy, the ability to imagine what another person is feeling. Or they can mean something else, a transfer of information from one mind to another with no normal sensory link. No sound, no sight, no touch, no text, no hidden cues. That last meaning is what researchers try to test. If it exists, it would change how we think about consciousness. It would also raise practical questions about privacy and ethics, and it would blur the line between what is inside the skull and what is not. But if it does not exist, then the entire field is a long story about human error, about wishful thinking, about statistics, about how easy it is to be fooled by coincidence and clever methods. So tonight, we move slowly. We will not treat telepathy as a single yes or no. We will treat it like a stack of folders. Folder 1 holds personal reports, twins who say they feel each other, parents who say they knew their child was in danger, partners who say they received a thought like a message. Folder 2 holds laboratory studies, card guessing, Ganzfeld experiments, dream telepathy trials, remote viewing style protocols. Folder 3 holds modern variations, phone call presentiments, online tests, brain-to-brain experiments with computers. Folder 4 holds skeptical explanations, sensory leakage, fraud, data phishing, optional stopping, publication bias, and the harsh truth that a tiny effect can appear even when nothing real exists if enough flexibility is allowed. Folder 5 holds the open questions. What would we accept as proof? What would a clean demonstration look like? And why has that demonstration not arrived yet? There is also a cultural layer. Telepathy stories appear in religion, folklore, and entertainment. That matters because expectation shapes experience. And there is a modern layer too. Documentaries and series have brought the topic back into public conversation. They often mix personal testimony, lab history, and suspense. That can be useful. It brings attention. But it can also be risky. It can turn uncertainty into certainty. It can make weak evidence feel strong because it is told well. So we will use modern media only as narrative color, as an example of how people talk about telepathy. The core of the case, the thing we test, will be the methods and the data. Now, take a slow breath. One more rule before we begin. We will separate three things: anecdote, which can be moving; experiment, which can be scored; an explanation, which must compete with alternatives. If you keep those three layers separate, you can enjoy the stories without being trapped by them, and you can judge the data without turning it into a religion. Let the night widen, and as we go, we will label certainty carefully, so you can sleep with clarity, not slogans. We begin with the oldest and most common evidence for telepathy: personal experience. Personal experience has a special power in this topic because it often arrives without warning. A person is not looking for telepathy. They are washing dishes, driving, falling asleep. Then a thought arrives with a sharp edge, like it did not come from the usual place. They describe it as a message, not a vague mood, but a specific idea. Call your sister. Do not take that road. He is not okay. Then later, something happens that seems to match. This is one reason documentaries about telepathy can feel persuasive. They highlight the emotional clarity of the moment. The person remembers the exact texture of it. But we have to be careful. Emotional clarity is not the same as factual accuracy. Traumatic memories can feel sharp and still be wrong on details. Dreams can feel like visits and still be the brain. And when a story is retold, the edges get sharpened. The timing gets cleaned up. The message becomes more exact. This is not lying. It is how narrative works. So the responsible stance is to treat personal stories as a starting point, a place to ask questions, not a place to end them. A person is thinking of someone, and that person calls. A person dreams of a relative, and the next day learns the relative died. A parent wakes up at night with a feeling of dread, and later learns their child had an accident at that time. Two twins report the same unusual sensation at the same moment, while far apart. These stories are widespread. They also have a major problem. A big world creates coincidences. If you have millions of people and each has many thoughts per day, then some thoughts will match later events just by chance. If you have many dreams, some dreams will match future news. If you have strong bonds, you think about the people you love often. That increases the chance of a match. And when a match happens, it feels like a signal. Humans remember the hits. We forget the misses. You might think of your friend 100 times, and they do not call. Then the one time they do call, your mind lights up. It feels meaningful. This is called selection bias. It is not a moral flaw. It is how memory works. So personal reports are not useless, but they are not enough. There is also another hidden issue in personal reports: language. When people describe a telepathic moment, they often use words like received, sent, heard, or saw. Those words are borrowed from the senses, but many people also admit something else. The experience did not feel like hearing with ears. It felt like a thought that arrived already formed. This matters because it changes what we should test. If telepathy, if it exists, is not a clear sentence, then experiments that demand exact words may fail, even if a weaker signal exists. On the other hand, if the signal is so weak and so vague that it cannot be separated from imagination, then it is not useful as evidence. So a good test must live in the middle. It must ask for information that is specific enough to score, but flexible enough to match how people claim telepathy actually feels. Ganzfeld was partly designed for that reason. It invites imagery and impressions, then forces a choice at the end. Whether that method is capturing a real signal or simply capturing human pattern matching is the central question. A better use of personal reports is to turn them into test ideas. If people report telepathy in dreams, then we can try to test dream telepathy. If people report a sense of being watched, we can test whether people can detect attention. If people report a sudden thought that carries a specific message, we can test whether specific information can be transmitted. This is where the lab enters. The simplest early lab tests were card guessing. A sender looks at a card. A receiver tries to guess the card. If guesses are right above chance, that suggests a signal. In the 1930s and 1940s, J.B. Rhine and colleagues at Duke University became famous for running large numbers of card guessing and related ESP experiments. Supporters treated the results as evidence. Critics later argued that the controls were not always strong enough, that handling and recording could create bias, and that the effects did not hold up cleanly across independent replications. Sometimes the cards were not truly random. Sometimes the experimenter could unconsciously cue the participant. Sometimes records were sloppy. Sometimes people cheated. So card guessing is a classic example of why controls matter. It also teaches another lesson. The effect sizes, when claimed, are usually small, not like reading a whole paragraph from a mind, more like a subtle statistical tilt. A small effect is hard to trust because small effects can be created by small mistakes. If you want to convince a skeptic, you need either a very large effect or extremely strong controls. Now, one of the most famous modern lab paradigms for telepathy is the Ganzfeld experiment. Ganzfeld means something like total field. The goal is to reduce normal sensory noise. A receiver sits in a comfortable state. They might have halved ping pong balls over their eyes. They might listen to white noise. They relax and report impressions. Meanwhile, a sender watches a target image or video. Later, the receiver is shown several possible targets and must pick which one matches their impressions. If the receiver picks the true target above chance, that is a possible sign. Ganzfeld studies have produced controversial results for decades. In the 1980s and 1990s, two names show up again and again in the arguments. Charles Oniton, who was one of the main proponents of Ganzfeld research, and Ray Hyman, a psychologist and well-known skeptic. They publicly debated methods, then worked toward a joint statement about what a proper Ganzfeld study should look like. The point was not to agree on telepathy. The point was to agree on safeguards, better randomization, better blinding, better handling of target pools, better record keeping. After that, some labs ran what were sometimes called automated Ganzfeld studies, where parts of the procedure were handled by computer to reduce queuing. When supporters talk about evidence, they often point to meta-analyses that combine many Ganzfeld studies and report a small above-chance hit rate. When critics respond, they often point to the same things, but with names attached. They point to the file drawer problem described by psychologists in many fields. They point to sensory leakage risks that Hyman emphasized. They point to analytic flexibility, where different inclusion rules can change the result. Believers respond that when you filter to higher quality Ganzfeld studies, the effect does not vanish. Skeptics respond that the effect shrinks and can be explained by bias. That is the core dispute. Now, we need to be careful about what meta-analysis means. It is a method where you combine many studies to estimate an overall effect. It can be useful. but it can also be misleading if the input studies are biased. If only positive studies are published, a meta-analysis will be inflated. If researchers try many analyses and report the best one, that can inflate results too. This is called p-hacking. Also, if a field has many small studies, random noise can create apparent significance. So the strongest argument for Ganzfeld is not that a meta-analysis exists. It is that the effect remains even when you apply stricter filters, and that independent groups find similar results. Now let us talk about dream telepathy. This is the idea that a sleeping mind might be more open. Dreams are already strange. They are not tightly tied to the senses. So if telepathy exists, maybe it shows up in dreams. In dreams telepathy experiments, a sender focuses on an image or a story while the receiver sleeps. The receiver is woken and reports their dream. Judges then try to match the dream report to the target among decoys. This is hard work. Dreams are symbolic. A dream could match many targets in vague ways. So scoring is tricky. If judges know the target, they can be biased. If judges do not know, they still might see patterns. So the best dream experiments must be double-blind. And they must predefine scoring. One of the most cited real-world dream telepathy programs took place in the 1960s and 1970s at Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn. The names that appear in that file are Montague Ullman, a psychiatrist, and Stanley Krippner, a psychologist. They ran nights where a receiver slept in a lab setting and a sender focused on a target picture. Supporters say some nights produced striking correspondences. Critics say dream content is so flexible that matching can happen by chance, and that judging methods can drift if scoring is not locked down. They also point out that the most impressive stories are often the ones repeated, while the many ordinary nights fade from memory. Believers respond that some sessions seem unusually specific, even under blinding. Again, we come back to the same theme. Strong claims demand strong methods. Now, another term that appears often in this world is remote viewing. Remote viewing is a protocol where a person tries to describe a distant location or a hidden target. In the 1970s, two names that show up in many summaries are Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff, researchers associated with work at Stanford Research Institute, often shortened to SRI. This work later became entangled with broader government interest and programs that, in later years, were often discussed under umbrella names like the Stargate program. Remote viewing is not strictly telepathy between two people. It is closer to a claim of perception at a distance, but it is discussed alongside telepathy because it raises the same core question. Can a mind access information without ordinary senses? Supporters point to cases they call hits. Critics point to judging problems, vague descriptions, and selection effects, where the best stories are kept and the failures are forgotten. The historical fact that government money touched the topic is real, but funding is not proof. It only shows that some officials considered it worth exploring. Now step back and ask, if telepathy were real, why would it be so weak? Why would it be a small statistical effect? Why would it not be reliable? Believers have several answers. One answer is that telepathy might be like a weak sense, like a faint smell in the wind. It exists, but it is easily drowned out. Another answer is that belief and emotion matter. Maybe it works best with strong bonds. Another answer is that the lab environment is unnatural and the effect shuts down. Skeptics have a simpler answer. The effect is weak because it is not real. The weak signal is just error. So a fair investigator asks, what would distinguish a weak real signal from weak error? The answer is replication under tight controls. Now we will build the skeptical toolkit clearly. First, sensory leakage. This means information slips through normal channels. A sound, a reflection, a timing cue. A participant might hear the click of a projector. They might see a shadow. Even subtle cues can create above-chance results. Second, experimenter effects. Humans communicate without realizing. A raised eyebrow, a pause. If the experimenter knows the target, they might cue the participant unconsciously. So double-blind matters. Third, optional stopping. If a researcher runs the study and checks results often, they might stop when significance appears. That inflates false positives. Fourth, multiple comparisons. If you test many outcomes and only report the best, you get a false signal. Fifth, publication bias. Positive studies are exciting and get published. Negative studies get buried. Sixth, fraud. Not common, but it exists. Seventh, file handling errors. A data entry mistake can look like a miracle. Eighth, expectancy effects. Participants may try harder when they believe. They may also interpret ambiguous results in a favorable way. Ninth, poor randomization. If targets are not truly random, patterns can be exploited. 10th, statistical misunderstanding. People confuse statistical significance with practical significance. They also confuse correlation with causation. Now, with this toolkit, skeptics can explain a lot. But skeptics have a burden too. If a field keeps producing a small effect across many labs with strict controls, then dismissing it forever is not scientific. So the real question is, does telepathy research show a consistent, replicable effect under strict controls? The honest answer today is complicated. Some meta-analyses suggest yes. Some reanalyses suggest the effect shrinks or vanishes when you correct for bias. Some newer studies try to pre-register methods to reduce flexibility. The results remain debated. Now let us talk about pre-registration, because it is a key modern improvement. To see why it matters, imagine two studies that look identical from the outside. In both studies, the headline is the same. Ganzfeld telepathy test. 4-choice target. 100 trials. A small above chance hit rate. But inside the machine, the two studies are different. In the first study, the researchers decide everything in advance. They set the sample size. They define exclusions. They define how hits are counted. They commit to one analysis. They upload the plan to a public registry. Then they run the study. In the second study, the researchers start and then make small decisions along the way. They look at the data after 20 trials. They adjust the target pool because some targets feel too similar. They decide to exclude a participant because they were tired. They decide to analyze only the trials where the receiver reported strong imagery. They decide to try a second scoring method. None of these decisions are evil. Many are reasonable. But together they create a problem. They create flexibility. And flexibility creates false positives. This is why pre-registration matters more for telepathy than for many other topics. When a field is built on small effects, the fence around the method must be tall. Now, even pre-registration is not a magic shield. A researcher can pre-register a weak plan, or they can pre-register many plans and only highlight the best. So the strongest form is pre-registration plus open data plus independent replication. But pre-registration is still a major step toward trust. Pre-registration means the researcher writes down the plan before collecting data. They specify sample size. They specify the analysis. They specify what counts as success. This reduces p-hacking. In a field like PSI research, pre-registration is vital. If a pre-registered, double-blind Ganzfeld study shows an effect, that is more persuasive. If many do, that is even more persuasive. Now, another modern angle is physiological presentiment. Presentiment is not exactly telepathy. It is more like a warning signal. The claim is that the body shows a small reaction before an unpredictable emotional stimulus. For example, a computer picks a calm image or a disturbing image at random. Researchers measure skin conductance, heart rate, or pupil size. Some studies report that the body changes a little before the emotional images, more often than chance. If true, it would suggest that the mind can access information from the near future, or that time in the nervous system is not as simple as we assume. Skeptics respond with several critiques. One is expectation. If emotional images appear at some rate, the body might become tense in anticipation, and random clustering could make it look predictive. Another is analysis flexibility. If you can choose different time windows, different baselines, and different filters, you can manufacture an effect. Another is subtle sequence bias. If the random generator is not perfect, patterns can exist. Another is data cleaning. Removing outliers can change results. Believers respond that some presentiment effects remain across studies, and that some meta-analyses find a small signal. Skeptics respond that meta-analyses are vulnerable to publication bias, and so we return to the same central struggle: tiny effects, tiny errors. Now, why mention presentiment in a telepathy episode? Because it shows how the word telepathy often expands. People start with mind-to-mind information. Then they move to mind-to-world. Then mind-to-future. The broader claim is that mind can access information beyond ordinary senses. So telepathy becomes one wing of a larger bird. A documentary series will often glide across these wings without stopping to label them. That can be exciting. But for evidence, labels matter, because each claim requires different controls. This is the claim that the body reacts slightly before a random future stimulus. For example, skin conductance might change before an emotional image is shown. These studies are controversial too. They also touch a deeper question. Is time strictly one way in the mind? Or can information leak backward? This sounds like science fiction, but it is sometimes argued using quantum language. We must be careful here. Quantum mechanics is real, but people often use it as a magic word. A careful person does not accept a quantum excuse for weak evidence. Instead, they ask, is the effect real? Is it replicable? If it is, then we look for models. Now, let us talk about the social side. Why do people care about telepathy? Because it speaks to loneliness. It suggests we are not closed off. It suggests connection. It also speaks to fear. The fear that our thoughts are not private. It speaks to wonder. The feeling that reality is bigger. And it speaks to control. People want special knowledge. These motivations matter because they can bias both believers and skeptics. A believer might want it to be true. A skeptic might want it to be false. Both can distort judgment. Now, the documentary approach is to describe what we know with clear labels. We know that many people report telepathic experiences. We know that coincidence and bias can explain many. We know that some lab studies report small effects. We know that methodological problems can create small effects. We know that meta-analyses are contested. We know that the topic has not produced a single clean demonstration that convinces the broader scientific world. That is where we stand. Now, you might ask a simple question. If telepathy is real, why has it not been proven? A believer might say, because the effect is subtle and hard to measure, because mainstream science is hostile, because funding is low, because ridicule keeps people away. A skeptic might say, because it is not real, because when controls improve, effects vanish, because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Both sides have points. Ridicule can harm research, but also extraordinary claims do require strong evidence. Now let us go deeper into what strong evidence would look like. The best demonstration would be simple, repeatable, and high effect. For example, a sender chooses one of 4 targets. A receiver guesses correctly 80% of the time under strict isolation. That would be shocking. It would be replicated quickly. It would change textbooks. We do not have that. Instead, we have small effects. So the field lives in statistics. Now, statistics can be honest, but they can also hide problems. So careful researchers build layered safeguards. They use random number generators. They isolate participants. They use automated systems. They pre-register. They share data. They invite skeptics. When those safeguards are in place, a small effect becomes more interesting. Now let us acknowledge another possibility. Sometimes a field can show a small effect that is real, but not what people think. For example, experimenter bias could create an effect, or participants could sense patterns in pseudo-randomness, or the random generator could be flawed. So even if an effect is consistent, the cause might not be telepathy. This is why interpretation is harder than detection. Now, there is a popular claim that telepathy is strongest between people with deep emotional bonds. Twins, mothers and children, long-term partners. If that is true, then the best experiments would target those pairs. Some studies have tried. The results are mixed. A skeptic says the bond increases expectation and memory bias. A believer says the bond increases signal. Now, let us shift to modern technology. There are experiments sometimes called brain-to-brain interfaces. A person thinks of something. A machine reads a brain signal. The machine sends a signal to another person. The other person perceives it. This is not telepathy in the paranormal sense. It is technology. But it changes how we think about mind-to-mind links. It shows that in principle, minds can be connected. It just does not prove a natural channel exists. Now, another modern area is online testing. Large numbers of participants can be tested. This reduces some problems, but it also introduces new problems. Cheating is easier. Attention is lower. Environmental controls are weak. So online evidence is not strong. Now, let us bring in the narrative elements people love. Stories. A docu-series might present interviews with people who feel telepathy in their lives. It might use suspense music. It might show reenactments. It might mention experiments. This can make the topic feel proven. But a good documentary mind asks, were those claims tested? Were the experiments controlled? Could the results be selection? Are there transcripts? Are there failures shown? Often, media shows the hits. It rarely shows the misses. So use media as a doorway, not as a verdict. Now let us build a calm conclusion about what evidence we have gathered. The strongest evidence for telepathy is not personal stories. It is the best controlled lab studies that show above chance results. Ganzfeld is often placed at the top of that list. Some dream telepathy studies are also cited. Some presentiment studies are cited. But the strength is limited by the size of the effect and by debate over bias. The strongest skeptical critique is not mockery. It is the history of small effects disappearing when methods improve. It is the reality of publication bias. It is the ease of subtle leakage. It is the lack of a decisive demonstration. Now, what do we do with that? We do something simple. We remain honest. We say, telepathy is not proven. Telepathy is not disproven in a clean way either, because you cannot prove a negative across all possible methods. What we can say is that the evidence is suggestive to some and unconvincing to others. And we can say why. Because this field is a battle between tiny effects and tiny errors. Now, in a quiet archive story, we can end with a human note. Even if telepathy is not real, the stories teach us something. They teach us how much we long to be connected. They teach us how memory and coincidence can feel like messages. They teach us how the mind searches for patterns. And if telepathy is real, even in a faint way, then the stories teach us something too. They teach us that consciousness might not be sealed. They teach us that the boundary between self and other might be thinner than we think. And that is a strange thought to fall asleep with. Not fear, just wonder. The idea that minds might touch, or that we believe they do. And in either case, the world becomes a little more mysterious. Now, before we let the archive close, we add more pages to the file. Not to force an answer, to make the map more complete. We start with history, because telepathy did not begin on the internet. In the late 19th century, a group of researchers and scholars formed organizations to study what they called psychical research. They were not all mystics. Many were educated, some were skeptical, and some were simply curious. They collected reports of apparitions, mediumship, and thought transference. Early telepathy work often used simple tasks, guessing numbers, symbols, drawings. It was crude by modern standards, but the motivation was clear. If mind-to-mind transfer exists, it might show up in simple tests. The first problem they met was the same problem we meet today. People are not reliable instruments. They want to succeed. They get bored. They cheat. And experimenters want results too. So the field slowly learned a hard lesson. If you do not build strong controls into the structure, you will fool yourself. That lesson is part of why telepathy remains controversial. The history is full of claims that later collapsed. Now, a second major area is the difference between telepathy and other CSI concepts. Telepathy is mind to mind. Clairvoyance is mind to world, like describing a hidden object without a sender. Precognition is mind to future, like guessing a future event. Many experiments do not clearly separate these. They create a situation where any psi, if it existed, could help. This makes interpretation harder. If a Ganzfeld receiver picks the right target, is it telepathy from the sender? Or is it clairvoyance of the target? Or is it precognition of the future judging step? A skeptic might say none. A believer might say the distinction is not important because the core point is information without senses. But for careful analysis, the distinction matters. Now let us go deeper into Ganzfeld so you understand why it became a flagship. A typical protocol works like this. First, the target is chosen at random from a pool. Usually the pool contains short video clips or striking images. Second, the sender is placed in a separate room. The sender watches the target and tries to mentally send it. Third, the receiver is placed in a relaxed state. They might have a red light. They might have white noise. They are encouraged to report whatever comes to mind. Shapes, emotions, scenes. Fourth, at the end, the receiver is shown a set of possible targets, often 4 items. 1 is the real target. 3 are decoys. Fifth, the receiver picks which target matches their impressions. In a 4-choice design, chance is 25%. So if over many trials the hit rate is meaningfully higher than 25%, that is the signal. Now, what makes Ganzfeld different from card guessing is that it tries to reduce ordinary cues and increase vivid mental imagery. It also makes the receiver more comfortable. But the same vulnerabilities remain. If the experimenter knows the target, they can cue. If the decoys are not well matched, the target might stand out. If the randomization is flawed, patterns might exist. If judges are not blind, scoring can be biased. So modern Ganzfeld studies emphasize blinding and automation. Now consider the most common skeptical criticism of Ganzfeld meta-analyses. Even if the combined result is statistically significant, the effect size is usually small. Often the hit rate is only a few % above chance. In a clean world, that could be real. In a messy world, it could be bias. So skeptics ask, can you show that the effect remains when you include only high-quality studies? Can you show that it remains when you correct for publication bias? Can you show that it replicates in independent labs with registered protocols? Believers respond that these conditions have been approached and that the effect does not vanish. Skeptics respond that the field still has too much flexibility and too many researcher degrees of freedom. Now, a listener might wonder why this is not settled by a single giant study. It could be. A single large pre-registered study run by a mixed team of believers and skeptics with fully automated procedures could be extremely informative. If it produced a strong effect, the conversation would change. If it produced no effect, the conversation would change too. But such studies are expensive. They are hard to fund. They are hard to organize because the field is polarized. Now, let us talk about another classic protocol, the one that is easy to picture. A sender looks at a simple image. A receiver draws what they sense. The drawing is compared to the target. This is attractive because it looks more like telepathy in movies. But scoring drawings is subjective. So modern protocols use blind judging, and they force choices. Even then, subjective matching can creep in. A drawing with waves could match many images. So the best judging procedures define scoring rules clearly. Now we move to the idea of telepathy in real life. This is where docu-series tend to focus. They might include stories of families who claim unusual shared experiences. They might include twins describing the same dream. They might include a person who suddenly speaks a phrase and later learns the phrase was said by someone else at the same moment. They might include a pattern of coincidences that feels too strong. A series like that can be compelling because it is human, and it can be useful because it suggests hypotheses. For example, does telepathy correlate with emotional intensity? Does it correlate with crisis events? Does it correlate with sleep states? Does it correlate with meditation? But again, media shows selected cases. To make it scientific, you need systematic collection. That means You record the prediction before the outcome. You keep the misses. You define what counts as a hit, and you compare to chance. Now, let us build a concrete example of how a coincidence can feel like telepathy. Imagine you have a friend. You message them often. One day, you think of them, and they message you. That feels meaningful. But how many chances did you have? You think of them many times in a month. They message you many times. A match will happen. Now add emotion. Your mind notices it. It becomes a story. Now the same logic applies to dreams. You dream of many people. Some of those people will have events. Sometimes the dream will match. And because death and crisis are emotionally heavy, the matching dreams are remembered. This does not prove there is no telepathy. It proves that our intuitive sense of probability is weak. So a careful telepathy researcher tries to build experiments where chance is clear. Now let us go deeper into statistical pitfalls, because this is where most disputes live. If you run one experiment and you get a p-value of 0.05, that means that under a specific model, the observed result would occur 5% of the time by chance. But it does not mean there is a 5% chance the result is random, and it does not account for multiple experiments. If 100 labs run a study and nothing real exists, you still expect about 5 labs to find p less than 0.05 by chance. If only those 5 are published, the literature looks positive. This is why publication bias is deadly. Now, another issue is effect size inflation. Small studies produce noisy results. When a small study gets a positive result, it often looks larger than it really is. Then replications shrink. This pattern happens in many fields. So when you see a strong claim from a small study, you should ask for larger replications. Now let us talk about replication directly. Some telepathy effects appear in some meta-analyses, but individual replications are often inconsistent. A believer says the effect depends on state and context. A skeptic says inconsistent effects are what you expect from noise. A neutral investigator says both are possible. And that is why pre-registered multi-lab replication is valuable. Now, let us talk about fraud and deception risk. Most participants are honest, but the stakes can be high. Fame, money, validation. In the history of paranormal claims, there have been hoaxes. So good protocols assume no one is trusted. Not because people are evil, because science is a system built to work even when people are flawed. So a good telepathy lab design includes physical separation, sound isolation, no shared air vents or windows, no phones, no internet, automated target selection, locked data, blind analysis. Now let us add another modern concept, Bayesian thinking. Bayesian reasoning asks, what is the prior probability that telepathy is real? Then it asks, how much should a piece of evidence update that belief? A skeptic might say the prior is very low, because telepathy would violate the known limits of biology. A believer might say the prior is not that low, because consciousness is poorly understood. Different priors lead to different conclusions. This is why debates can feel endless. People are not only arguing about data, they are arguing about what kind of world is likely. Now, let us make that question explicit. If telepathy exists, what could be the mechanism? One possibility is a physical signal we have not identified. But that is hard. Any signal would likely be weak, and it would have to pass through walls. Another possibility is that consciousness has non-local features. That information can be shared in ways not mediated by known signals. This is speculative. A skeptic will say it is a fancy way of saying magic. A believer will say it is an honest admission that our models may be incomplete. We do not solve mechanism tonight. We only note that mechanism questions matter, because a mechanism can make predictions. Now let us look at the kinds of predictions believers sometimes make. Telepathy should be stronger with emotional bonds. Telepathy should be stronger in altered states, like sleep or meditation. Telepathy should be stronger when the sender is focused and calm. Telepathy should be weaker when the receiver is distracted. Telepathy might be stronger when targets are emotional. Some studies claim patterns like these. Some do not. Now, let us look at the concept of target emotionality. In Ganzfeld, targets can be chosen to be emotionally rich. A target that is vivid and unusual might be easier to sense, or it might simply be easier to match by chance. So targets must be balanced. If the real target is more vivid than decoys, hit rates can inflate. So careful experimenters match decoys by category and intensity. Now let us return to the everyday, because the everyday is where telepathy belief grows. People experience a sense of being watched. They turn around and someone is looking. This feels like telepathy. But there are normal explanations: peripheral vision, sound cues, knowledge of social patterns. Still, some researchers have tested attention detection. They set up trials where a person is either stared at or not. They measure whether the person can detect it above chance. Results are mixed and controversial. Now, consider another classic claim: twins. Twins often report strong bonds. They also share genetics and environment. They often learn to predict each other. So twin telepathy stories are interesting but not decisive. If you wanted to test twin telepathy strongly, you would need separation, random targets, blinding, many trials, and careful scoring. Now let us talk about a modern question. Could telepathy be related to the mirror neuron system? Mirror neurons are a concept in neuroscience about how we perceive others. When you see someone act, your brain activates similar patterns. This helps empathy and imitation. Some people loosely connect this to telepathy, but that is not evidence. It is metaphor. So we keep neuroscience and PSI separate unless a specific test links them. Now, we add another folder: ethical and practical implications. If telepathy were real, how would we use it? Could it help communication with people who cannot speak? Could it help in therapy? Could it create privacy problems? Could it be weaponized? These questions sometimes appear in documentaries, but the honest truth is that a weak, unreliable effect would have limited practical use. If telepathy is real but faint, it may remain a curiosity. If it is strong and reliable, the world would notice quickly. Now let us focus again on what we know. We know the best evidence comes from controlled studies. We know the best critiques are methodological. We know there is no consensus. Now, we can offer a careful framework for a listener. If you want to explore telepathy responsibly, do this. Do not trust your memory alone. Write down predictions before outcomes. Define what counts as a hit. Track misses. Use randomization. Avoid phishing. If you do this, you will often find that your sense of telepathy becomes more ordinary. But if after a long record you find a pattern that remains above chance, that is at least personally interesting. Now let us also say this: many people who believe in telepathy are not foolish. They are responding to experiences that felt real. Many people who disbelieve are not cold. They are responding to the history of error. Both sides can be sincere. So the best outcome is not a fight. The best outcome is better experiments. Now, let us return to the documentary tone. Tonight, we examined what we know about telepathy. We saw the personal reports. We saw the lab methods. We saw Ganzfeld and dream protocols. We saw the skeptical toolkit. And we saw why this remains unresolved. Because the claims are large. And the evidence is often small. Now, before we close, we add a deeper layer. This is where we take the word evidence and ask what it means in practice. Evidence is not only a result, it is a process. In telepathy research, the main question is not only, did it work? The main question is, could it have worked by normal means? So a careful telepathy file includes long, boring details, room layouts, soundproofing, randomization logs, timestamps, who knew what and when. This matters because the most common natural explanation for telepathy results is not that people are stupid. It is that information can leak. And information leakage can be subtle. Imagine a receiver is in a room with white noise. You might assume they cannot hear anything, but maybe there is a faint rhythm in the wall, a vibration when the sender starts the video, a door click, a keyboard sound. The receiver does not consciously hear it, but the brain notices patterns. Now imagine the target pool includes categories: water scenes, city scenes, animals, faces. A tiny cue could shift guesses. Now imagine decoys are not matched well. The true target is more vivid. Even without any cue, the receiver might pick it because it stands out. Now imagine that after the session, the receiver is shown the choices. If the experimenter smiles slightly when the receiver looks at one option, that can matter. People are social creatures. We read faces. Now imagine the experimenter is honest and careful. Even then, expectation can leak. This is why automation is so valuable. A computer can present targets. A computer can log choices. A computer does not smile. But even computers can leak information if the system is not designed well. For example, if the randomization algorithm is predictable, or if the file names reveal patterns, or if the target order is not truly random. So you see why this topic is hard. A tiny effect can be produced by a tiny hole. Now, let us talk about fraud again, but in a calm way. Fraud is not the default, but it exists, and telepathy tests can be cheated. A person could signal with prearranged codes. A person could use hidden devices. A person could peek. A person could use assistants. Modern labs can block this by searching participants, by isolating rooms, by using cameras, and by using independent observers. But it adds cost, and cost limits sample size. So the field often ends up with small studies. Now, let us bring in another part of the file that people rarely discuss: negative results. There are many negative telepathy studies. They often do not become famous, but they matter. A field with only positive results is suspicious. A field with a mix of positive and negative results is more believable, because reality is messy. So one of the best signs of maturity in a field is that researchers publish failures. Some PhD researchers do, some do not. Now, a key modern improvement is open science. Share protocols, share data, share code. Invite criticism early. In theory, this could help telepathy research more than almost any other field, because the main problem is trust. Trust the method. Trust the data. Now, another part of the file is the psychological profile of telepathy experiences. People often report telepathy when they are stressed, when they are grieving, when they are in love, when they are half asleep, when they are in altered states. These are states where memory and perception can be unusual. So a skeptic can say, those are the exact states where false impressions are likely. A believer can say, those are the exact states where the mind might be open. Now, consider the concept of dissociation. In dissociation, the mind can split attention. A person can feel detached. They can have vivid inner imagery. If telepathy is a kind of imagery shaped by another person, dissociation might play a role. This is speculative, but it suggests testable ideas. For example, do people with high absorption report more hits? Some studies suggest correlations. Skeptics point out that this could be because high absorption people are more willing to report matches. Again, the same pattern. Everything depends on controls. Now, another area that is often used as a rhetorical weapon is anecdotal extremes. The one story that sounds impossible. A person claims they received a sentence word for word. A person claims they saw a specific event in their mind. A person claims they knew a secret. These stories can be real. They can also be created by ordinary means. A forgotten conversation, a subtle hint, a lucky guess, or an embellished memory. So the right response to an extreme story is not belief or disbelief. It is documentation. When did the person first report it? Was it recorded? Could the person have learned it? What is the base rate? How many similar claims failed? Now, the reason we keep returning to base rates is simple. People underestimate how often rare events happen. If you flip a coin many times, long streaks occur. If you have many dreams, some will match. If you live in a large network, coincidences occur. And if you add strong emotion, coincidences feel like messages. Now, with that foundation, we can enter the final museum section. This is the part where we slow down and walk through the strongest arguments on each side, like you would walk through a museum exhibit, one room at a time. First room, the believer's simplest argument. They say, look at the pattern. Across decades, across labs, across different paradigms, there are reports of small but repeatable effects. Not huge, not movie style, but there. And they say the effect often appears when the receiver is relaxed, when the target is vivid, and when there is emotional connection. They also say ridicule prevents the best scientists from entering the field, so the field remains underfunded and underpowered. And they say mainstream science has blind spots. It once mocked meteorites. It once mocked germ theory. It once mocked hypnosis. So mocking PSI is not an argument. The only honest argument is better testing. Second room, the skeptic's simplest argument. They say small effects are exactly what you expect from bias. They say humans are excellent at squeezing meaning out of noise. They say if you give a researcher many degrees of freedom, they can find significance even when nothing exists. They say publication bias is not a minor detail. It can fully manufacture a field. And they say the lack of a single decisive demonstration is telling. If telepathy were real in any strong way, it would be easy to show. Third room, the careful middle. This room is less exciting, but it is where truth usually lives. The careful view says, the human mind can create strong illusions of telepathy, and at the same time, the current evidence is messy enough that it does not fully close the door. So the careful view says, study it with strict methods. Do not claim certainty. Do not sell miracles. Now, let us make these rooms more concrete. Imagine you are judging a Ganzfeld study. You ask, was the target pool large enough? If the pool is small, participants can learn it. If the pool is reused often, patterns emerge. Then you ask, Were the decoys matched? If decoys are weak, the target stands out. Then you ask, were participants isolated? No shared hallways, no shared sounds, no experimenter whispers. Then you ask, was the process automated? If a computer handled randomization and presentation, that reduces queuing. Then you ask, was the analysis pre-registered? If yes, you reduce p-hacking. Then you ask, was the data shared? If yes, others can verify. Then you ask, was it replicated? And here, the story often becomes unsatisfying, because a single lab can show a small effect, but another lab shows nothing, and a third lab shows a small effect again. In normal science, this can happen too, but in PSI research, it becomes a battlefield. Believers say the effect is sensitive. Skeptics say the effect is noise. Now let us talk about one of the most important concepts in modern science communication, the replication crisis. Many fields have discovered that published results often fail to replicate, not because science is broken, because incentives are imperfect. Journals want novelty. Researchers want publications. Small studies are cheaper. Flexible analysis is tempting. So false positives appear. This matters because PSI research looks a lot like the kind of field where false positives thrive. Small effects, many methods, many endpoints, strong desire for a positive result. So a skeptical person can say, Psi results are exactly what you expect from the replication crisis. A believer can respond, yes, but Psi research has faced these criticisms for decades, and some researchers have adopted stricter methods early, like blinding and pre-registration. So it is not fair to dismiss everything. Now let us bring in a specific kind of reasoning. Suppose you run a 4-choice Ganzfeld study with 100 trials. Chance expects 25 hits. If you get 32 hits, that looks interesting. But you must ask, how many studies did you run and not publish? How many different analyses did you try? Did you stop early? Did you exclude participants after seeing results? These small choices change the meaning. Now, another important topic is the difference between statistical significance and evidential strength. A p-value can be small, but a tiny p-value can still arise from bias. And a small p-value does not tell you the probability telepathy is true. It tells you what the data would look like under a specific null model. So the best approach is to look at total evidence. Now let us add another kind of evidence that is often discussed. Physical distance. If telepathy is a normal physical signal, distance should matter. If telepathy is non-local, distance might not matter. Some studies attempt to test distance. Results are mixed. Often the data are too weak to conclude. Now, consider shielding. If you put sender and receiver in Faraday cages, does the effect change? Some experiments have tried. Again, results are mixed. And critics point out that Faraday cages do not block everything, and that the studies may still be vulnerable to other biases. Now, let us consider the concept of a learning effect. If telepathy is real, perhaps people can train it. If that is true, then participants should improve over time. Do they? Often not clearly, which is a problem for a strong telepathy model. But it could also mean that training is hard and the signal is weak. Now let us consider a very practical question. Could you test telepathy at home in a way that teaches you something without fooling yourself? Yes, if you are disciplined. You would need randomization. A phone app can choose targets. The sender can be in another room. The receiver records their guess before feedback. You log every trial. You do not stop early. You do not change rules. After many trials, you look at the hit rate. If you do this honestly, most people will find that the hit rate returns to chance. That does not disprove telepathy for all time, but it shows how much the mind exaggerates the feeling of connection. Now, a documentary series like Telepathy tapes often focuses on a different kind of evidence: the emotional story, the sense of pattern. It might emphasize that some people report the same phrase, the same dream, the same impression. It might show families and communities where telepathy is treated as normal. It might include investigators who claim strong results. This is valuable as a human story, but as evidence, it remains vulnerable unless the series shows the full dataset, the misses, the failed sessions, the strict controls, the pre-registration, the independent replication. Without those, a series can make telepathy feel stronger than it is, so we use it as a reminder. Telepathy is not only a lab claim, it is a human hope, it is a fear, it is a narrative, and narratives are powerful. Now, we add one more section. What would settle the question? Imagine a future experiment, a large team, believers and skeptics together, a fully automated Ganzfeld design, targets chosen by a secure random generator, all sessions recorded, all analysis pre-registered, all data published, thousands of trials. If the hit rate is consistently above chance by a meaningful margin, then the field changes. If it is not, then the field changes too. The answer might not become absolute, but uncertainty would shrink, and that is what science is for. Now let us add a final practical summary, like a label on the file folder. What we know with high confidence. We know that people can feel strong telepathy-like experiences. We know that many of these can be explained by ordinary psychology and ordinary probability. We know that humans underestimate coincidence. We know that memory reshapes stories. We know that social cues are powerful. We know that fraud has existed in adjacent paranormal fields, so controls must be strict. What we know with medium confidence. We know that some laboratory paradigms have produced above-chance results in some contexts. We know that Ganzfeld is one of the most studied. We know that some meta-analyses claim a small effect. We know that skeptics have legitimate criticisms about bias. We know that the field has improved methods over time, but debate remains. What we do not know. We do not know whether any observed effect is telepathy or something else. We do not know a mechanism. We do not know how to make the effect reliable. We do not know whether the field is looking at a real signal or a long echo of bias. Now, if you ask what is the most honest stance, it is this: do not treat telepathy as proven. Do not treat it as impossible either. Treat it as an open question with contested evidence. And if you want to be wise, apply the same rule to your own experiences. Respect them, but test them. Write them down. Count the misses. Let the numbers speak. And when you look at the numbers, be patient. A week is not enough. 10 trials is not enough. A handful of uncanny hits can happen by chance. The only way to learn is repetition with rules you do not change midstream. That is the same discipline science demands in a lab. It is also a quiet kind of respect for the truth, whatever the truth is. Now, let us return to the quiet end. One more gentle thought before the lights go out. In debates about telepathy, people often speak like lawyers. They say, "Show me proof." Or they say, "I have proof." But most real knowledge does not arrive like a gavel. It arrives like weather, a long pattern of small changes. So if you want a realistic picture of telepathy research, imagine a slow weather map. Some days the signal seems to form. Some days it dissolves. Some labs report a small drift above chance. Some labs report nothing. And the field keeps circling the same question. Is this a real low-level human ability that we have not learned to stabilize? Or is this a story about statistics and belief? Now notice something. If telepathy were real but weak, it would feel exactly like this. Hard to catch, hard to repeat, strong in stories, thin in numbers. And if telepathy were not real, it would also feel like this, because a large number of experiments will always produce some apparent signals. So the feeling of the field does not decide it. Only tighter testing does. That is why the most important question is not, do you believe? It is, what would change your mind? If you are a believer, what result would make you doubt? If you are a skeptic, what result would make you accept? If you cannot answer that, you are not doing investigation. You are doing identity. So tonight, if you take one thing, let it be this. Keep your wonder. Keep your caution. Ask for clean methods. And when you hear a story, enjoy it. But do not let it become a verdict. Let it be a clue. Let it be a question. Then let the question rest. Let the archive close. Let the questions rest. Let the night hold what it holds. If telepathy is real, it may be one of those quiet truths that sits at the edge of measurement. If it is not real, the fact that so many people feel it says something deep about human connection and how the mind reaches across distance in imagination and love. Either way, you do not need to decide tonight. You only need to understand what is claimed, what is tested, and what is still uncertain. This was a quiet archive story, where the story ends, sleep begins.